Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Trump on Hong Kong, protecting democracy or more meddling in the internal affairs of China. Also, can NATO's European members reimagine the alliance, and more terror on the streets of London? Cross-talking some real news. I'm joined by my guest, Robert Bridge. He's an RTU website writer. Also, we have Dimitri Babic. He's a political analyst and editor at InnoSemi Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's go to Marcus first in London, and let's talk about the Trump administration's agreement, at least tacitly, to sanction China over what's going on in Hong Kong. There's something I just don't really seem to understand. I mean, in looking at Hong Kong, I know that there's an enormous amount of inequality there. That is the responsibility of the Hong Kong government, and it's a one country, two systems. So why all the arrow at Beijing? And of course, we know the United States is cheering it on, along with its Western allies, as an irritant to China. Go ahead, Marcus, your thoughts.
Well, Peter, anyone who is au fait with hybrid warfare can conclude that what is happening in Hong Kong, indeed what has been happening since the summer, is concerted, is well planned, and is exceedingly well executed. And it is only possible through the support of special services. Then we have to ask, which special services in the world are behind it? Well, all you merely need to do is look at the so-called protesters in Hong Kong, and in my opinion, they are no longer protesters, they are militants. Look at the flags they are waving. They are waving American and British flags. Look at the anthems they are singing. They are singing the American and British anthems. Look at the support, the political support they are now receiving from America. This week, we had Donald Trump sign into law a package which condemns China and risks further American tariffs because of the so-called repression in Hong Kong. So it is my opinion that American and British services are attempting to destabilize Hong Kong. No, right. Yes, knowing Hong Kong is a big revenue earner for Beijing.
Well,
but also, Peter,
but you know what? But what is happening here is that they're hurting themselves, Hong Kong, in the process here. Dima, one of the interesting things is that if you look at the media, you know, it's all about democracy. Oh, yes. But why are they waving a British colonial flag? There was no democracy in Hong Kong under British colonial rule. What are they talking about? Or is that just a talking point?
Obviously, this was the right kind of colonialism. It was British colonialism. It was not Russian colonialism or Spanish colonialism. But I just love this, you know, in the Wall Street Journal, you know, first they describe the peaceful protesters who were just standing for their freedoms, and then just the next paragraph. On Thursday, police collected hundreds of Molotov cocktails, hauled out baskets of primitive weapons, including slingshots and bows with arrows, and cleaned the wreckage, with hundreds of people injured, you know. So, you know, the Western media can choose, are they peaceful protesters, or do they have hundreds of Molotov cocktails? It's the same story as with Kiev, you know. The Western media wants to have it both ways. They want to intimidate the government, to intimidate the population, and at the same time to have this image of purely peaceful protests.
But you know, one of the interesting things, Robert, I think it's fascinating, again, looking at through the media prism, you would get the impression that Hong Kong and China are two different places. You would get the impression that Hong Kong is not part of China. And that is a narrative, a media narrative that is being pushed. This is an internal affair of China.
Well, if you look at Peter, at the anti-China legislation that Trump is pushing through, it's very ironic to me that one of them is that it bans the export of non-lethal munitions. Okay, so we're talking about tear gas, tasers, pepper spray. Okay, so it's interesting to me that these are the exact type of weapons that the Western governments regularly use against their own people. I mean, notably in Paris, for example, in Paris, France, what's happening there? We have these yellow vest protesters. I mean, people are having their eyes shot out with rubber bullets. Okay, so when the West does something like this is fantastic. It's the protection of democracy. But when China does it, here we have, you know, grave human rights violations.
But I just loved it, you know, the comment of President Trump when signing this bill. I signed these bills out of respect for President Xi, China, and the people of Hong Kong. Well, you know, Trump's hypocrisy is interesting because it's so open.
Well,
I'm
not really sure it's even hypocrisy. I think it's
out
less
of
than
respect
that.
for Xi?
Okay, but you know, but Marcus, I mean, this is clearly an attempt to create a hostile relationship with Beijing. I mean, this is something. It was a unanimous decision in Congress here. I mean, again, this is using sanctions as a political weapon, and it's baiting Beijing to do something. They want something to happen. So far, nothing has, other than some rhetoric coming out of Beijing. What's the gambit here? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, it's not just Hong Kong that is on the radar of the Americans and the British. There is another region of China that, in my opinion, truly constitutes an Achilles heel of China, and that is the westernmost region of China, a largely speaking Muslim-inhabited region called Xinjiang. Now, Peter, this is a region that I have been talking with Russian officials and Chinese officials for about 5 years now, and it's my conclusion that Xinjiang, not at the moment, but potentially could become what Chechnya was to Russia in the 1990s and the early 2000s, a bleeding wound, because we are starting to read now in American media and in British media these completely malicious and outrageous and unfounded allegations that the Chinese authorities have set up concentration camps in Xinjiang. No, what the situation is in Xinjiang is that it is a hotbed for Islamic fundamentalism, and the Chinese military and the Chinese police are cracking down, as they should be. But of course, we know that the Americans and the British have strategic relations.
This is something we've seen before. This is another playbook here. Go ahead, Zima, go jump in.
Well, it's amazing. The Western press itself reported several years ago that the so-called Islamic State was active in Xinjiang and in other Muslim regions.
We know that people from that region were in Syria.
Absolutely. The same story with Burma, you know, when it happened, when there were problems with the Muslim minority there. But it's very interesting, you know, this ideology, ultraliberalism, formally it's about open borders, you know, supporting internationalist spirit, you know. But when they fight their enemies, and these are usually big countries such as Russia, China, immediately they pick the enemies, you know, the neighbors or the minorities inside these countries. And the West supports worst kind of crude nationalism
like the destruction of Yugoslavia, which Marcus knows a lot about. Go ahead, keep going.
Croatian fascists against Serbs, Ukrainian, Polish nationalists against Russia. Now, Muslim fundamentalists in Xinjiang against China. So it's one of the amazing traits, amazing features of this new totalitarian ideology, ultraliberalism,
and it's all done in the name of human rights, isn't it? That's the cover. Go ahead, Robert.
And internationalism, you know, in the name of one world, you know.
Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I think you pretty much covered it, Dima. But one thing I think that needs to be added is that while the West, while the United States and NATO, through many decades of the regime change operations, you know, we were investing our money in what? War. Okay. What was China investing in? The new Silk Road.
But the West is investing in war for outcomes that it cannot control. Marcus, reflect upon that, because I've said on this program 10 years now, is that when does the regime change operation actually bring positive results? It always ends in disaster, misery, and destruction. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, it does. And the latest example of that is in Ukraine, where the average Ukrainian person is now suffering immensely because of what took place, the coup that took place in 2014. But whilst I agree with you, Peter, it always ends in death and destruction. It always benefits American global hegemony. And this regime change orchestrated by Washington is not going to end Bolivia is the most recent example that I can cite to support my assertion.
Marcus,
that
you and I very, very often agree with each other, and I'll meet you halfway on that. Hegemony is extended for a time period, but it is a very unstable hegemony. Dima, jump in.
You're absolutely right that this is hegemony that benefits, because the United States as a country lost financially because of what happened in Ukraine. The Ukrainian market shrank, relations with Russia soured, there were mutual sanctions between the United States, the EU, and Russia. So basically, the Western globalists, they are ready to lose their taxpayers' money in huge amounts, only to have these so-called
it's taxpayer money, Dima, and they make profits with the arms.
And their entrepreneurs' money also. Well, with Hong Kong, what is interesting is that the markets did not react to this so-called Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act. They almost didn't budge.
I refuse to even use the term, okay? It's so Orwellian. Finish up.
Yeah, but the markets did not react. But the point is that the United States government now will have to make a report every year how autonomous Hong Kong is. So this is bad for business, because it's none of their business how autonomous Hong Kong is now. It became a part of China, basically. There is a transition period. There is free press in Hong Kong. There are many anti-Chinese newspapers coming out. South China Morning Post, Hong Kong Free Press. They're in English. They're available. There were elections recently. So it's none of the business of the United States or of the UK to check how democratic, how autonomous Hong Kong is.
Unfortunately, the world works differently. We're going to go to a break here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Okay, let's go back to Marcus in London. We have an upcoming NATO summit. It's been truncated to 2 days. I guess they want to avoid any fireworks. They wanted to have a perfectly scripted summit, as they usually do. But it seems to me that there are different trajectories in play for the possible future of NATO. Now, one thing is for sure, NATO needs to exist. It exists to exist. That is its primary objective. And to do that, it needs to expand. But Macron, the French president, came out and said that NATO was brain dead, which, of course, I very rarely agree with the French president, but I agree with him on this point. And I tend to agree that that's Donald Trump's gut feeling, too. But that's a topic for another program. Marcus, brain dead NATO. Go ahead.
Well, Peter, I would want to see nothing more than the demise of NATO, this decadent, this terrorist, this wretched criminal organization that has caused abject pain and suffering for over 20 years now. But whilst I believe that NATO has overstretched itself by having expanded into Eastern Europe, by having expanded into the Baltic states, I do not see its imminent demise. Indeed, I don't see its demise at all. I believe that if you just look at a map of Europe, the fact that Ukraine, as each day goes by, is integrating more and more with the West means that NATO is even more important than before. Forget Trump, forget Boris Johnson, forget Macron. The real people in power in America and Britain and France are the ones you don't see, and their commitment to NATO cannot be challenged. It cannot be broken. We spoke recently about the amount of money the Americans have poured into Ukraine since the coup in 2014. And yes, that money has gone on Ukrainian corruption, but the Americans get something in return. They are increasing their presence, and with it, NATO's presence in Ukraine. The Americans are not just active on Ukrainian land. They are active now at Ukrainian ports. They are challenging Russia in the Black Sea. And the ultimate prize for NATO is Ukraine's accession to NATO.
Okay,
while some people might say it's possible. It is possible.
It is possible, Dima, but I tend to think if you look at what's coming out of Berlin and what's coming out of Paris, I think there's some different ideas being thought of here. I mean, Macron it seems to me, wants to recreate some kind of Napoleonic empire, okay? Or as someone on Crosstalk told me last week, is that Macron wants to essentially sell the French military to the Germans, okay? But at least the capital be in Paris. Well, but the brain dead statement is important here because it does show a different vision here. Well, I'm not really sure if it's going to work. I know that Macron wants to be another de Gaulle, which there's only one de Gaulle and only will be only one de Gaulle. But I mean, there are the forces in Washington, you know, the Atlantic Alliance world. But there are some new things happening right here because there are tensions with the U.S.
The most interesting thing about this statement from Macron about the brain death of NATO was the reaction to it, how intolerant NATO leaders are. You know, Chancellor Merkel of Germany said, "You want your destructive policy, and I have to glue together the."
Yeah, well, look what she did in Ukraine. Okay,
Absolutely.
Why is she an authority on anything?
Absolutely. Well, the Polish Prime Minister Tadeusz Morawiecki also scolded Macron, you know, saying that his statement was irresponsible. I mean, look how intolerant these people are. And they accuse Erdogan of intolerance. Erdogan was angry because Macron invited the leaders of Kurdish groups, you know, to Paris. He was also angry because Lindsey Graham in the United States is facilitating a visa for someone whose real name is Abdi Shaheen, but who is called General Kobani by the U.S. Well, I mean, how would you react if someone who is considered a terrorist in your country is welcomed by the president?
But Dima, you bring up these inconvenient facts. But, you know, my point is here is that the media is projecting the seamless, unanimous, forward-looking, you know, blah blah blah. You know, but you just in a few seconds you gave us some real differences here.
There is a fissure between Turkey and the rest of NATO. There is a fissure between France and Germany and East European countries on the other side. But what is most important, I agree with Marcus, you know, when he said in the beginning that NATO has caused more wars recently than it prevented. I mean, the wars in Ukraine, in Georgia, ask every real foreign policy expert. He will tell you the real reason. The real reason was the decision to expand. You know, both Georgia and Ukraine were promised NATO membership in 2008. Immediately wars started in these countries. Why? Because this is unacceptable for Russia, and because these countries' leaders felt kind of encouraged to act
about Russia. You know, Robert, let's be fair here, and maybe Marcus will disagree with me. During the Cold War, I understand the need for existence of NATO during the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. NATO should have dissolved as well.
Absolutely.
But, you know, Dima is very knowledgeable about all of this here. But if you look at, you know, Georgia and Ukraine, I mean, I think most Americans don't understand, people in the Western world don't understand that the West has no treaty obligations to Ukraine whatsoever. But as Marcus told us a few minutes ago, you wouldn't know that from the media and from the clueless bureaucrats that went in front of Chairman Schiff's committee for impeachment.
Only Pat Buchanan wrote, "What do we do in
Pat
Ukraine?" Buchanan's
a saint, in my opinion. But you know, Robert, it gets down to, no matter how you want to spin it, its mission to exist is an anti-Russian expression institutionally.
No, absolutely, and I would probably argue that it's less that NATO is so-called brain dead as it is purposeless dead. I mean, purpose dead. There just doesn't seem to be any coherent activity on their part. Action, aside from what you're saying, Peter, is just moving closer and closer and closer to the Russian border.
And
provoking the situation, you have, this is the first time in, I don't know how many years, Dima, that the Western troops have been right smack on Russia's border. This is a tremendously dangerous thing, and it could, the slightest little altercation could really make it explode.
We have President Zelensky in Ukraine trying to reach out, but he will have pressure in Washington and in the political elites in Kiev not to move forward.
The former Georgian President Saakashvili, he would have never attacked South Ossetia if he didn't feel reassured a few months before that at the NATO summit in Bucharest, when they said Georgia will join the alliance in some distant future, we don't know when. His reading of that signal was, now I can start a war. now I can crush these separatists, you know. So in this way, NATO provoked more conflicts in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years than it actually prevented.
Okay, talking about conflict here. Marcus, I want to switch gears here. The recent attack on London Bridge, which I think should outrage all of us. I can't even use the language on this program to express my outrage. Here's a man that was convicted of being involved in a terrorist operation, had his sentence halved and released because he was rehabilitated. How can people be rehabilitated when they have contempt for your institutions and their culture? How can you have that happen? This is an outrage, because what I see from the British elites and the media, that people should be given a second chance, fine, but victims only get one chance. Please reflect upon that, and I think my tone and tenor are correct here. Go ahead, Marcus.
Peter, London has a cancer and has had this cancer for many years now, and that cancer is violence, not just in the form of terrorism, Islamist terrorism, but also in the form of knife crime and gun crime. And despite that, what do we hear from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan? What do we hear from these so-called human rights groups? All we hear about are the rights of perpetrators, are the rights of terrorists, are the rights of people who commit knife crimes, are the rights of people who commit gun crimes, are the rights of people who throw acid in people's faces, not just at night, in broad daylight. And even though, once again, London has experienced another horrendous terrorist attack, no steps are going to be taken, in large measure because of political correctness. And this problem is not going away. It is costing the lives of innocent Londoners. What I would like to hear from my mayor, because I live in London, what I'd like to hear from these human rights groups is how the ordinary man and woman and child in London is going to be protected from terrorists, from gang culture, from people throwing acid in people's faces. I don't want to hear about how in schools, children from the age of 5 must be taught, because it's a human right, that if they don't feel like a boy or if they don't feel like a girl, they can go to a clinic in central London and have a sex change.
And
And those doctors who are carrying out these operations on children as young as 10 are committing child abuse.
This is what this is about. This is an attack on our culture, is what it is. And it's people taking advantage of one of our greatest virtues through the centuries, is our tolerance. But it's being trampled upon now. 30 seconds, go.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what's happening in London? What struck me about this attack is that the first thing I read was that the perpetrator was shot dead by 2 police officers. I found that kind of ironic that England is letting in all of these unrestricted immigrants into the country, okay? But yet they're not letting the people protect themselves. And it seems to me that pretty soon people are going to start saying, hey, if you're going to let all these people into our country unlimited, without any, restrictions, let us arm ourselves.
Okay, well, at least don't let the criminals out of prison like that. It's outrageous here. Dima, finish up the program. I'm kind of angry right now.
Well, there is also a huge discrepancy between the foreign policy of England and France and the terrorist threat. I mean, President Assad was never involved in any terrorist acts in England or France. Russia was never involved. Iran was not involved in the last at least 20 years. But all you hear in the Western media is how bad Assad is, how bad Russia is, how bad Iran is. So there's that huge discrepancy. The people who committed crimes, terrorist crimes in Paris and London, fought against Assad, the ones who made the terrorist act in Bataclan. So I think this is the most absurd,
That's a very good point to end this program here, and I hope people reflect upon it. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.